It's hard to picture human life without clothes at all, but there was a real point in our history before anyone wore anything, before the very idea of covering the body even existed as a concept. The strange part isn't that clothing started at some point. It's how scientists actually figured out roughly when, using something that has nothing to do with fabric, fossils, or archaeology at all: lice. Clothing itself creates a genuine research problem, because fabric and hide simply don't preserve well over tens of thousands of years the way stone tools or bones do, no matter how well preserved the surrounding site might otherwise be. There's no ancient shirt waiting to be dug up from a site 300,000 years old. For a long time, this meant the actual origin of clothing was essentially unknowable through direct physical evidence, a genuine blind spot in an otherwise well-studied timeline of human history. The eventual answer came from an unexpected direction: human lice. There are two distinct types that live on people: head lice, which cling directly to hair on the scalp, and body lice, which live almost entirely within clothing fibers, only briefly touching the skin to feed. Body lice physically cannot survive without fabric to live in. That single biological fact turns out to be an accidental historical record, because body lice as a distinct population could only have evolved after clothing already existed for them to live in. The biological split between these two lice types runs deeper than just where they happen to sit. Body lice lay their eggs directly in the seams and fibers of clothing, not on human hair at all, and they can only survive by returning to skin briefly to feed before retreating back into fabric. Head lice, by contrast, live their entire life cycle attached to hair, gripping strands with specially adapted claws shaped for exactly that purpose. These are meaningfully different physical adaptations, not just a difference in habitat preference, which is part of why researchers could confidently treat them as genuinely separate evolutionary lineages rather than one flexible species. In 2003, researcher Mark Stoneking and colleagues used this connection directly in a study that surprised even some scientists working in unrelated fields. By comparing genetic differences between head lice and body lice and applying a no-mutation rate to estimate how long ago the two populations split apart, they could calculate roughly when body lice first evolved as their own distinct lineage. Since body lice depend entirely on clothing to exist at all, that genetic split date effectively works as an indirect, but surprisingly precise, estimate for when humans first started wearing something regularly enough and consistently enough to sustain an entire separate species of insect living inside it. That research placed the origin of body lice, and by extension regular clothing use, at somewhere around 170,000 years ago, with later studies using slightly different methods and assumptions, suggesting a somewhat wider possible range on either side. That's a genuinely ancient date, placing clothing well before modern humans began migrating out of Africa in large numbers and spreading into entirely new climates. It also lines up suggestively with research on when humans lost most of their body hair, since a newly bare-skinned species facing cold seasonal temperatures for the first time would have had real, immediate reasons to start covering up rather than waiting for further biological adaptation. The timing connects directly to climate, and it's not a coincidence. This period overlaps with cooling phases and the approach of glacial conditions in parts of the world early humans occupied, environments considerably colder than the warm savanna landscapes many earlier ancestors were originally adapted to living in. A hairless body that once relied on sweating efficiently to survive brutal daytime heat suddenly needed a completely different solution for surviving cold nights and harsh winters, and draping animal hide or fur over the body was a direct, practical response to exactly that new problem, one that didn't require waiting on any further biological evolution to solve. This earliest clothing almost certainly wasn't anything like sewn garments. It was likely simple draped or wrapped animal hide, tied or held in place rather than shaped and stitched together, since the tools required for actual sewing hadn't been invented yet at this point in the timeline. Functional, but rough, more like a blanket wrapped and secured around the body than anything resembling a fitted piece of clothing in the modern sense. Sewn clothing shows up much later in the archaeological record, and there's genuine physical proof of exactly when it began appearing. Bone needles with a small eye for thread, essentially identical in basic function to a modern sewing needle, have been found at sites including Siberia's Denisova cave, dated to roughly 40,000 years ago. That's a massive gap, well over 100,000 years, between the earliest lice-based evidence for simple draped clothing and the first solid physical proof of fitted sewn garments that could trap warmth far more effectively against the body than a loosely wrapped hide ever could. A separate discovery adds another interesting wrinkle to this timeline. In 2009, researchers examining Dzudzuana Cave in the country of Georgia found tiny flax fibers, some showing clear signs of having been twisted and dyed with color, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago. That's strong evidence for genuinely woven textile technology, not just wrapped animal hide, existing well before some earlier estimates had assumed. It suggests the transition from simple draped coverings to more deliberately constructed fabric may have happened in overlapping, gradual stages across different regions, rather than through one single, clean invention moment researchers can point to as the definitive beginning. It's worth being honest about the uncertainty built into this whole method. Molecular clock estimates like the lice-based dating technique come with a real margin of error, sometimes spanning tens of thousands of years in either direction depending on the assumptions used, and different studies applying slightly different mutation rate calculations have produced somewhat different date ranges for this same underlying event. Clothing also likely served more than one purpose from very early on, not just warmth, but protection from sun, insects, and rough terrain, along with practical uses like carrying items over long distances, and quite possibly social or status signaling as well, all of which complicate any single, tidy explanation for why it started when it did. Put together, the story of human clothing and the story of human fur loss increasingly look like two connected chapters of the exact same evolutionary problem. A newly bare-skinned species figuring out how to survive a planet with genuinely wide temperature swings across different seasons and different regions, none of which its ancestors had needed to worry about while covered in fur. One solution came from inside the body, sweating efficiently in the heat when hair was no longer trapping warmth. The other came from outside it entirely, wrapping something else around yourself whenever the environment demanded it, and an accidental population of insects ended up being the closest thing to a fossil record either solution ever left behind. The next time you put on a jacket without thinking twice about it, it's worth remembering that simple act traces back roughly 170,000 years, verified almost entirely through the genetics of an insect nobody particularly wants to think about, let alone thank for the discovery. That's exactly the kind of hidden thread this channel exists to dig up. If you want more of these, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.